Tyler Vance was just looking for a place to crash after a grueling shift. But when he stumbled into an alien pod, he woke up bound to Mira, a deadly, silver-haired warrior who claims he's hers. As the pod's sync ties them together, the heat between them intensifies, and Tyler finds himself thrust into a savage battle where survival means facing off with a ruthless rival, Korr, who wants nothing more than to rip him apart. But Mira's fierce protection and the magnetic pull of their bond might be the only thing keeping him alive. Now, trapped in a high-stakes game of strength and fate, Tyler has to fight not just for his life, but for the fiery, dangerous woman who might just be the key to everything. Will their forbidden connection save them, or will it be the one thing that destroys them both? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling adventures. The Nexus station pulsed like a living beast, its corridors a chaotic tapestry of light and sound, stitched together by the clamor of the interspecies sleep festival. Tyler Vance trudged through it, a shadow among the revelry, his engineer's uniforms streaked with grease from 16 hours of battling a failing fusion core. His shoulders sag, his dark eyes rimmed with exhaustion, and the hum of alien voices, Valyrian trills, Taxian clicks, grated against his fraying nerves. The festival's holographic banners shimmered overhead, proclaiming unity through shared dreams, but to him, it was noise. Meaningless pomp he'd rather escape. "Sleep," he muttered, voice rough as he rubbed his stubbled jaw, dodging a floating orb of Valyrian diplomats. Just a few damn hours. The human sleep pods were a battlefield of their own. Lines snaking through the residential wing, faces etched with the same fatigue he felt. He'd heard rumors of the festival's strain on resources, whispers of experimental tech from older species, but his mind was too fogged to care. He veered into a quieter passage, drawn by a flicker of instinct, until his gaze snagged on a lone pod, its sleek, iridescent shell pulsing with a faint green glow, larger than any human unit, its surface rippling like molten starlight. Alien script curled along its base, jagged and unfamiliar, etched into the metal with a precision that spoke of ages past. A faint hum emanated from it, low and resonant, like a heartbeat buried in the station's bones. Tyler squinted at a faded Nexus tag, Syrak Origin, Experimental Sync Unit, but the words blurred in his tired eyes. Green meant free, and that was all he needed. He pressed his palm to the panel, and the pod sighed open, exhaling a musky warmth that curled into his lungs, sharp and alive, tugging at senses he hadn't known were awake. Inside, silvery fur lined the walls, plush and luxurious, a stark contrast to the cold slabs of human design. Tyler kicked off his boots, the clang echoing in the passage, and sank into the softness, his body melting into its embrace as the tension in his shoulders unraveled. Pod, sleep cycle. 4 hours, he rasped, eyes drifting shut as the lid sealed with a melodic chime, encasing him in a cocoon of pulsing blue. The scent deepened, wild and earthy, like a forest after rain, and he let it pull him under, a dark tide swallowing the world. Sleep came swift, until a jolt snapped him back, sharp and electric like a current arcing through his core. His eyes fluttered open, bleary, then wide with shock as a presence loomed above him, close enough that her warmth brushed his skin. She was no human. Violet skin gleamed with a metallic sheen, taut over a frame both powerful and graceful, her silver hair spilling long and wild, like frost under moonlight. Her eyes, green, vivid as a jungle aflame, pierced through the haze, locking onto his with an intensity that stole his breath. She was striking, a figure carved from some untamed galaxy, her scent flooding him, stirring a heat he couldn't name. Tyler jolted back, his spine slamming against the pod's wall, heart pounding like a drum. "What the hell?" he gasped, voice raw with alarm. "Who are you?" She straightened, her presence filling the pod like a storm held in check, her silver hair swaying as she tilted her head. "I am Mira, commander of the Syrak Vanguard," she said, her voice a low, resonant melody that vibrated in the air, steady yet edged with fire. You've entered my right, human. This pod has claimed you as mine. Her hand hovered near his chest, not touching, but the air crackled, alive with a force that pulsed in time with his racing heart. Claim me. Tyler's mind reeled, clawing for sense amid the fog. I just wanted to sleep. What are you talking about? Mira's lips curved, a faint smile bearing the edge of sharp teeth, her green eyes glinting with curiosity and certainty. The pod binds us, she said, leaning closer, her breath a warm whisper against his cheek, a desert wind teasing a flame. Soul to soul, strength to strength. You are my chosen, Tyler Vance, and I am yours. Her violet skin caught the light, shimmering like a blade, and the hum in his chest flared, a thread he hadn't asked for, pulling him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. The pod's blue glow pulsed like a heartbeat, casting flickering shadows across Mira's violet skin as she loomed over Tyler, her presence a storm trapped in the confines of ancient Syrak tech. Her silver hair brushed his arm, soft as a whisper of frost against his sweat-damp skin, and her green eyes, luminous, sharp as a blade, held him captive, stirring a heat that coiled low in his gut, unbidden and fierce. The air thickened with her scent, wild, earthy, like a forest after a storm, tugging at senses he'd thought dulled by exhaustion. Tyler's hands gripped the pod's plush edge, his mind scrambling to claw back from the edge of disbelief. Chosen, he rasped, voice rough with fatigue and shock, his gaze darting from her piercing eyes to the shimmering walls that seemed to hum with intent. Back up, explain this. I climbed in here to sleep, not to bind with anyone. What's this pod doing to me? Mira tilted her head, silver strands shifting like liquid starlight, her lips parting as she studied him with a mix of curiosity and unshakable certainty. This is no mere machine, she said, her voice a low melody, resonant and steady, laced with a fire that echoed in the pod's pulse. It is Syrak, forged by ancients to seek harmony, to weave two souls into one. She leaned closer, her breath grazing his jaw, warm and deliberate, a desert wind teasing a spark into flame. It reads you, your pulse, the rhythm of your blood, the mind that burns beneath your weariness. It chose you for me, Tyler Vance, as I chose it. His skin prickled, a shiver racing down his spine as her words sank in, her nearness pressing against him like a tide he couldn't outrun. My mind, he said, forcing a laugh that cracked under his nerves, his hands tightening on the pod's edge. I'm an engineer. I fix reactors, reroute systems. I don't weave with anyone. This has to be a glitch, some alien tech misfire. But even as he spoke, a hum flared beneath his ribs, faint yet insistent, like a circuit sparking to life against his will, syncing with the pod's rhythm. Her lips curved wider, a smile that bare the edge of sharp teeth, predatory yet soft, and her green eyes glinted with a knowing spark. No misfire, she murmured, her voice dropping to a husky whisper that coiled around his senses, tight and inescapable. I woke to your heat, your essence pressing against mine in the dark. My blood sang, my body answered. Her hand rose, hovering just above his chest, fingers tracing the air over his racing heart, and the space between them thrummed, charged with a pull he couldn't deny. Tell me you feel nothing, human. Lie if you must. Tyler's breath hitched, his mouth opening to protest, but the words faltered. There was something, a flicker of awareness pulsing in time with her presence, raw and electric, cutting through the fog of 16 hours labor. That's just adrenaline, he muttered, turning his face away, though the pod's walls offered no escape. Or exhaustion. I've been up too long. My head's a mess. She inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring as if tasting him on the air, and her silver hair swayed as she leaned closer, her violet skin catching the light like polished metal. A mess, perhaps, she said, her tone teasing yet sure, but a mess that calls to me. Your scent, steel and ash, steady as stone beneath the strain, drew me from sleep. It's no accident. Her hand dropped, brushing his arm as she straightened, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt racing through him, leaving a warmth that lingered like an echo in his bones. The pod's seal hissed open, spilling cold station air into their charged sanctuary, and Tyler stumbled out, boots clutched in one hand, his uniform clinging to his sweat-slicked frame. The corridor stretched before him, a gray expanse buzzing with alien onlookers, Valurans drifting in their orbs, Taxians casting crystalline glints. But Mira's presence followed, her violet form stepping into the light with a grace that made his clumsy exit feel absurd. Her silver hair flowed like a river of moonlight, and her eyes never left him, steady and unyielding. A Nexus security officer pushed through the crowd, datapad glowing in his grip, flanked by a Syrak envoy whose scales clicked faintly. "Mr. Vance," the officer said, frowning at the screen, "the pods logged a pairing cycle, complete and binding under Galactic Cohabitation Protocols, Section 47B. You're tied to her now." He nodded at Mira, who stood serene, her violet skin shimmering under the harsh lights. "Tied." Tyler's jaw dropped, his free hand raking through his hair. No way. I was just sleeping. This isn't sacred," Mira interjected, stepping beside him, her shoulder brushing his with a warmth that jolted him again. "The pod's right is ancient law to my people. Our scents have mingled. Our paths are one." Her tone was firm, but her gaze softened, a flicker of something deeper passing through her green eyes, pulling him in despite his resistance. A low growl rumbled through the air, silencing the crowd's whispers like a thunderclap. A massive figure shoved forward, a Syrak male, his gray skin scarred and mottled, his frame clad in living armor that clicked with each step. His yellow eyes burned beneath a jagged brow, fixed on Tyler with a fury that made his stomach twist. "Blasphemy," he snarled, his voice a deep quake that rattled the floor. "A human claims Mira, commander of the Vanguard?" Mira spun to face him, her posture shifting, fluid, lethal, a hunter poised to strike. "The pod has chosen Korr," she said, her voice cold and sharp, her green eyes blazing. "He's my life mate. You have no claim here." Korr's fangs flashed as he stepped closer, towering over them both, his claws flexing with menace. "No claim?" he roared, his gaze flicking to Tyler with a sneer. "I've hunted for you, Mira, bled across 3 cycles to prove my worth. This soft-skinned fool." He jabbed a clawed finger at Tyler, who straightened despite the tremor in his legs. "He's an insult to our blood. I invoke the hunt challenge." The Syrak envoy hissed, scales bristling, and the officer tapped his datapad, voice clipped. "Challenge noted. 96 hours, proving grounds. Standard right." Tyler's breath caught, his head snapping to Mira. "Hunt challenge," he said, voice tight with alarm. "What the hell is that?" Korr's yellow eyes narrowed, a predator's grin curling his lips as he leaned in, his breath hot and sour. 96 hours, human," he growled, venom dripping from each word. "You'll face me. A test of survival. Win, and you keep her. Lose, and I'll grind your bones to dust for daring to trespass on Syrak honor." Mira's hand shot to Tyler's arm, her grip firm and warm, grounding him as her eyes locked with Korr's. "You'll not touch him," she said, her voice a quiet storm, fierce and unyielding. "He's more than you see, Korr, and I stand with him." Her fingers tightened briefly, her scent swirling around him like a vow, a wild promise that sank into his bones as the crowd murmured, their translators buzzing with speculation. Tyler turned to her, her touch anchoring him even as his mind spun. "I'm not a fighter, Mira," he said, his voice low, raw with honesty, his free hand clenching his boots tighter. "I don't even know what I'm fighting for yet." Her green eyes met his, fierce and unguarded, her hand lingering as Korr's growl faded into the corridor's hum. "You'll fight for us," she said, her words a challenge wrapped in a plea, her presence pulling him deeper into a current he couldn't yet chart. "And I'll show you why." The Syrak envoy stepped forward, scales glinting under the lights, voice a hiss. "The right is set. The pods will is law, but Korr's challenge tests it. Prepare, human, or flee. Tyler swallowed, the hum in his chest pulsing louder, a thread he couldn't untangle, and Mira's gaze held him, a beacon in the storm as the corridor seemed to close in around them. Korr's towering silhouette lingered in the corridor's haze as his growl faded, swallowed by the Nexus Station's hum, but the weight of his challenge hung heavy, a blade poised above Tyler's throat. Mira's grip on his arm tightened, her claws pressing through his sleeve, her violet skin warm against him as she pulled him from the crowd's murmurs and the Syrak envoy's hissing gaze. "Not here," she said, her voice a low, urgent rumble, her green eyes darting back to where Korr had stood. "He's bound by right. No strike before the hunt, but he'll stalk us. We move now." Tyler stumbled after her, boots scuffing the cold metal floor, the pod sync pulsing in his chest, a tether that sharpened with every step, drawing him into her orbit. She led him through a labyrinth of passages, her silver hair streaming like a comet's tail under the flickering lights, past maintenance drones whirring in the shadows, and a Taxian technician who clicked disapprovingly at their haste. They reached a shadowed engineering bay, its walls a patchwork of sparking consoles and scattered tools, a sanctuary of steel he knew better than the battlefield she called home. The door hissed shut, sealing out the station's chaos, and the air settled into a quiet hum, broken only by the faint crackle of a malfunctioning panel. He dropped his toolkit onto a workbench with a heavy clang, sucking in a breath to steady his racing pulse. 96 hours, he said, voice tight as he ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, his fingers brushing a smear of grease from his earlier shift. "That's all we've got before he comes for me. I'm no match for that monster, Mira. I need something I can control, something I can build." His hands moved instinctively, pulling wires, a motion sensor, and a small charge from the clutter, fingers trembling as he sought refuge in the familiar. Mira stepped beside him, her violet skin catching the bay's dim light like a twilight horizon, her scent flooding the space, wild and deep, like a forest calling to a lost soul. "Korr fights with brute force," she said, her voice steady as she handed him a coil of wire, her fingers brushing his with a warmth that jolted him. "We'll counter with your mind and my edge." She moved closer, her hand sliding to his hip, guiding him into a stance, her touch firm and hot as a forge's glow, sparking a shiver that raced up his spine. "He'll charge blind. We'll make him fall." Tyler's breath caught, his body tensing under her grip as she adjusted his footing, her silver hair grazing his shoulder like a whisper of silk. "How do you move so damn quiet?" he asked, panting from the drill she'd begun. Sidesteps, feints, a rhythm alien to his engineer's frame. "I'm lurching around like a busted rig. Look at me." His foot caught a stray tool, sending it clattering, and he cursed under his breath, frustration flaring. She leaned in, her green eyes locking with his, her lips near enough that her breath warmed his skin, a soft heat that stirred a fire deep within him. "You're not broken," she murmured, her voice a velvet growl, "just untested in this dance. Let me guide you step by step." Her fingers pressed into his waist, a steady pressure that sent a jolt through him, and her scent wrapped tighter, a wild lure that made his pulse race. Inside, she felt it too, a warmth from him, a quiet light piercing the cold, endless nights of her past, a longing she'd buried beneath duty. Her gaze softened, unguarded for a moment, before she eased back, leaving the air thick with her presence. He shook his head, turning to the workbench, hands trembling as he rigged the trap, wires sparking, a charge humming to life. The pod sync pulsed stronger, and flashes came unbidden. Her memories, battlefields strewn with shattered scales, the roar of plasma cannons, a lone figure standing against a tide of foes, her hands stained with blood, not her own. "I saw it, Mira," he said, quieter now, the words spilling out as he twisted a connection tight. "Your wars, your pain. How do you keep going through that?" Her hand stilled over a blade she'd picked up, its edge glinting in the bay's faint light, her silver hair falling like a curtain as she paused. "Because I must," she said, her voice faltering, a rare crack in her iron resolve. "Syrak lived for war, It's our curse. I've stood alone, always, because no one saw past the blade. She looked up, her green eyes bright with a fragile trust, her fingers tightening on the hilt. But I saw you, calm in a reactor's meltdown, fixing chaos with a single tool, steady when all else burned. It struck me, maybe I don't have to stand alone anymore. Inside, she felt him pierce her armor, not just through the pod, but because he saw her, beyond the warrior to the soul beneath. Tyler met her gaze, his own softening despite the knot in his chest, his hands pausing over the trap. I didn't sign up for this, Mira, he said, raw and honest, his voice low as he set the charge aside. Not the pod, not the fight, none of it. I'm just a guy who fixes things. Her eyes flared, green and fierce, and she closed the distance, her violet skin shimmering like a dying sun, her presence a quiet storm that shook him. Nor did I, she said, her voice resonant, carrying a weight that sank into his bones. The pod forced us together. I hated it too. But what if we choose it? Her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that lingered like a spark, her sense swirling around him like a challenge, a wild promise that drew him toward an edge he hadn't dared imagine. He swallowed, his pulse loud in his ears, the trap forgotten as her words sank in. Choose it, he echoed, voice barely above a whisper, caught between doubt and the gravity of her nearness. You mean fight him together? Yes, she said, her green eyes searching his, bold and vulnerable, her hand hovering near his, the air thrumming with possibility. Not as pawns of Syrak law, but as allies, partners. Korr wants your blood, but I want your fire. Will you give it? Her fingers brushed his wrist, a whisper of heat against his skin, and the hum in his chest shifted, less a chain, more a thread he might yet claim. Before he could answer, a sharp crack split the air. The malfunctioning panel erupted in a shower of sparks, its screen flickering with a distorted Syrak rune. Mira spun, blade raised, her stance protective as Tyler ducked, heart pounding. What now? He muttered, grabbing a wrench as the bay's lights dimmed, casting them in shadow. Trouble, she said, her voice grim, her green eyes narrowing as the rune pulsed, a warning from the past they couldn't yet read. The engineering bay flickered in the aftermath of the panel's explosion, sparks raining down like dying stars, casting jagged shadows across Tyler and Mira. The air crackled with ozone, sharp and bitter, mingling with her wild, earthy scent, forest after rain, that clung to him even now. Tyler clutched the wrench, his knuckles white, heart still pounding from the sudden jolt, while Mira stood poised, her blade gleaming in the dim light, her violet skin taut with tension. The distorted Syrak rune pulsed on the broken screen, its edges bleeding into static, a cryptic warning neither could decipher. What the hell was that? Tyler rasped, voice rough as he straightened, brushing sparks from his sleeve. His eyes flicked to the panel, then to Mira, her silver hair glinting like a beacon in the chaos. This place is falling apart, or someone screwing with us. Mira lowered her blade, her green eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to the console, her claws tracing the rune's outline without touching it. Not an accident, she said, her voice a low growl, steady yet edged with unease. This is old Syrak, a signal a lock. Someone's watching. Her gaze darted to the door, then back to him, and her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting warmth that steadied his nerves despite the hum of danger in the air. Watching, Tyler echoed, dropping the wrench onto the workbench with a clang, his mind racing as he pieced it together. Korr? The envoy? Who else knows about this damn pod? He turned to the trap he'd been rigging, wires tangled around a humming charge, and frowned, the pod's sync pulsing in his chest, sharper now, like a warning of its own. Before she could answer, the bay's calm crackled to life, a harsh voice cutting through the static. Commander Mira, Tyler Vance, report to Central Command. Now, the line died as abruptly as it had sparked, leaving a silence that pressed against them like a physical weight. Mira's jaw tightened, her silver hair swaying as she sheathed her blade, her violet skin catching the faint light like a storm-lit horizon. Trouble's not waiting for the hunt, she muttered, her green eyes meeting his, fierce and unyielding. Come, we face this together. Her hand lingered on his arm, her touch a quiet fire that sparked through him, and he nodded, grabbing his toolkit as they moved, the hum in his chest sinking with her steady stride. Central Command loomed at the station's core, a cavernous chamber of sleek metal and glowing holoscreens, its walls lined with Nexus officers and alien delegates. A human counselor stood at the center, her uniform crisp, her gray eyes cold as she watched them approach. Beside her, the Syrak envoy from the corridor clicked his scales, yellow eyes glinting with suspicion, while a Taxian observer hovered silently, its crystalline form refracting the light in eerie patterns. Vance, the counselor began, her voice sharp, tapping a datapad that flickered with their profiles. Your incident with the Syrak pods raised flags. It's not just a pairing, it's triggered something. Readings from the pod show anomalies in your biosignature. Trace elements, non-human, ancient. She paused, her gaze cutting to Mira. And you, Commander, your Vanguard's rights are under scrutiny. Explain. Mira stepped forward, her posture unyielding, her silver hair framing her face like a crown of frost. The pod chose him, she said, her voice resonant, slicing through the chamber's hum. It binds us by Syrak law, soul to soul, strength to strength. Your scrutiny changes nothing. Her hand brushed Tyler's, a subtle anchor, and her scent, wild, intoxicating, swirled around him, a quiet defiance against the council's glare. The envoy hissed, scales bristling. A human with Syrak traces? Preposterous. He's a fraud, or a threat. Korr's challenge must prove it, or end it. Tyler's stomach twisted, his hands clenching at his sides as he stepped up, voice steady despite the tremor in his legs. I'm no fraud, he said, meeting the envoy's glare. I didn't ask for this, but I'm not running either. If that pod says I've got something ancient in me, fine, let Korr come. I'll face him. His eyes flicked to Mira, her green gaze a lifeline, and the hum in his chest flared, a mix of fear and fire he couldn't name. The counselor's lips thinned, her datapad chiming as she swiped through data. The pod's logs confirm it, DNA markers dormant, activated by the sync. You're a hybrid, Vance, whether you knew it or not. Nexus can't ignore this, or the Syrak claim. She turned to Mira, voice cold. Korr's rallied support. Whispers of sabotage, of war if this bond stands. The hunt's not just a right now, it's a gambit. Win, and your assets. Lose, and we cut ties. Mira's eyes flashed, green and fierce, and she closed the distance to Tyler, her violet skin shimmering like a dying sun. We'll win, she said, her voice a quiet storm, her hand sliding to his wrist, her claws grazing his skin with a heat that sank into him. They doubt you, I don't. Your mind, my blade, were more than they see. Her breath brushed his ear, a whisper of fire against the council's chill, and her scent wrapped tighter, a wild lure that made his blood sing. The Taxian observer chimed, its voice a crystalline hum. Intriguing. A bridge between kinds, dangerous, yet potent. We watch with interest. Tyler swallowed, his pulse loud in his ears as Mira's touch lingered, her presence a shield against the chamber's weight. Assets or not, he said, voice low, meeting her gaze. I'm not here for their games. I'm with you whatever this is. His hand brushed hers, fingers grazing her violet skin, and the hum shifted. Less a mystery, more a choice he was starting to claim. The counselor nodded curtly, dismissing them with a wave. Prepare, then. The hunt's in 90 hours, and Korr's not alone. Watch your backs. As they turned to leave, the chamber's lights flickered, a shadow moving beyond the holoscreens. A gray figure, scales clicking faintly, watching from the edge. Mira's grip tightened, her green eyes narrowing, and Tyler felt the thread between them pulse, a bond forged in fire, now facing a storm neither could yet name. The proving grounds loomed beyond the Nexus station's hull, a vast simulation chamber carved into an asteroid's core, a jagged sprawl of synthetic cliffs, swirling mists, and robotic predators prowling beneath a crimson sky. Tyler stood at the threshold, his trap-laden pack heavy on his shoulders, the weight of 90 hours preparation grounding him against the dread coiling in his gut. Beside him, Mira adjusted her blade, its edge glinting like a shard of moonlight, her violet skin shimmering with a faint sheen of sweat under the chamber's harsh light. Her silver hair was tied back, strands escaping to frame her face like frozen flames, and the pod's sync pulse between them, a steady hum, a lifeline woven through the chaos ahead. Korr's waiting, Tyler said, voice low as he scanned the terrain, his breath misting in the cold air of the prep bay. Him, and whatever he's brought. These traps better hold. They're all I've got against that beast. His fingers brushed the remote trigger in his pocket, a small comfort amid the unknown. Mira's green eyes flicked to him, fierce and unwavering, her hand resting on his arm with a warmth that cut through the chill. They'll hold, she said, her tone a quiet thunder, steady and sure. Your mind is sharper than his claws, Tyler. He'll charge. We'll turn his strength to ruin. Her fingers lingered, a steady pressure that sent a shiver through him, and her scent, wild like a forest under rain, wrapped around him, a silent vow that steadied his nerves. The gates groaned open, releasing a gust of damp, metallic air, and they stepped into the mist, the ground crunching beneath their boots. Tyler triggered his first trap, a net of electrified wire concealed in the rocks, and moved low, Mira shadowing him with a grace that made his steps feel clumsy. The chamber hummed with unseen threats, drones buzzing faintly overhead, their red eyes glinting through the haze, and Korr's roar echoed ahead, a guttural bellow that shook the air and sent Tyler's pulse spiking. Close, he whispered, crouching behind a jagged outcrop, his hand tightening on the trigger. Mira pressed beside him, her shoulder against his, her breath warm against his ear as she murmured, "Let him come. We're one now. Trust it." Her violet skin brushed his arm, hot as a forge's glow, and the pod's sync flared, flashes of her past surging into him. Blood-soaked plains, a lone warrior against a tide of foes, a strength forged in solitude. He saw her see him too, hands steady on a failing reactor, calm amid chaos, and the bond deepened, a thread weaving tighter in the heat of the hunt. Korr burst through the mist, his gray bulk a nightmare of scars and armor, claws raking the stone as he charged, his yellow eyes burning with fury. Tyler hit the trigger, and the net snapped up, crackling with energy, tangling his legs. Korr roared, thrashing free with a swipe that shredded the wires, but Mira lunged, her blade a streak of silver, slashing at his flank, drawing a spray of dark blood. "Now!" she shouted, and Tyler activated a second trap, smoke bombs erupting in thick plumes, blinding Korr as he swung wildly, his claws slicing air. They darted through the haze, Tyler's mind racing as he hacked a nearby console with a scavenge tool, rerouting the chamber's drones to swarm Korr. The beast bellowed, swatting at the machines, their metal shells sparking as they fell, and Mira pulled Tyler back, her hand gripping his wrist, her claws grazing his skin with a heat that sank into him. "Brilliant," she said, her voice raw with adrenaline, her green eyes blazing as she pressed closer, her scent overwhelming, a wild lure that made his blood sing. But the drones faltered, their red eyes flickering as a new sound cut through the chaos, a low, guttural laugh from the mist. Korr straightened, his armor clicking, a jagged grin splitting his face as two Syrak warriors emerged behind him, scales glinting, blades drawn. "You thought me alone?" he snarled, voice a quake that rattled cliffs. "The Vanguard's honor is mine, not yours, human filth." Mira's grip tightened, her body tensing like a coiled spring, her silver hair whipping as she spun to face them. "He's broken right," she hissed, her green eyes flashing with fury. "Allies in the hunt. It's forbidden." She stepped in front of Tyler, blade raised, her violet skin aglow with defiance. But Korr laughed again, his warriors fanning out, their shadows stretching long in the crimson light. Tyler's heart pounded, his hand fumbling for a third trap, a pulse emitter untested, rigged in the bay's final hours. "Mira, cover me," he said, voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. And she nodded, lunging at the nearest warrior with a cry that echoed off the rocks. He dropped to one knee, wiring the emitter to the console, sweat beading on his brow as sparks flew, the hum in his chest sinking with her every move. Her blade clashing, her breath ragged, her strength a mirror to his focus. Korr charged again, smoke parting around him, and Tyler hit the trigger. A wave of energy pulsed out, slamming into the Syrak trio, their armor sparking as they staggered, roars turning to grunts of pain. Mira seized the moment, her blade slicing through the second warrior's guard, felling him in a spray of blood, while Tyler rolled aside, Korr's claw missing him by inches, tearing stone instead. The mist thickened, the crimson sky spinning above as they fought. Tyler's traps and Mira's blade against Korr's rage and his last ally. The emitter's pulse faded, its charge spent, and Korr towered over them, blood dripping from his flank, his yellow eyes locked on Tyler. "You're nothing," he snarled, raising a claw. But Mira threw herself between them, her blade meeting his arm in a shower of sparks, her violet skin pressed against Tyler's side, a shield of fire and will. "Together," she gasped, her voice raw, her green eyes meeting his, bright with a trust that burned through the chaos. Tyler nodded, hand finding hers, fingers lacing briefly as he triggered a final trap, a hidden charge beneath Korr's feet. It erupted, stone shattering, and Korr roared as he fell into the chasm below, his ally scrambling back, the fight draining from his eyes. Tyler slumped against Mira, chest heaving, the mist swirling around them as silence fell, broken only by their ragged breaths. Her silver hair tangled in his fingers, her violet skin hot against his, and the pod's sync pulsed, a bond forged in blood and ingenuity, unbreakable now. "We're not done," she whispered, her hand on his chest, feeling his racing heart, her green eyes fierce with a promise yet to unfold. The proving ground's crimson sky dimmed as the simulation chamber's gates slid open, their groan echoing through the mist like a dying beast's last breath. Tyler staggered out, his trap-laden pack, now a hollow weight, its contents spent in the chaos of the hunt. Dust and sweat streaked his face, his uniform torn at the shoulder where Korr's claw had grazed him, but the fire of victory burned steady in his chest. Beside him, Mira emerged, her violet skin glistening with a sheen of exertion, her silver hair tangled and wild, catching the Nexus Station's sterile light like a cascade of starlight. Her blade hung at her side, streaked with dark Syrak blood, and the pod sync pulsed between them, a rhythm forged in battle, a bond now etched in their bones. The prep bay buzzed with Nexus personnel, medics rushing forward, drones whirring to scan the chamber's wreckage. But Tyler's world narrowed to Mira as she turned to him, her green eyes bright with triumph and a raw, unguarded warmth. "We did it," she said, her voice low and resonant, cutting through the clamor. "Korr's fallen. Your traps, my blade. They underestimated you." Her hand brushed his, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through him, her scent, wild, like a forest after rain, wrapping around him like a quiet vow. He met her gaze, his breath steadying despite the heat her words stirred, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said, voice rough but sure, his fingers grazing hers in return. "That emitter was a long shot. Your timing made it work." The hum in his chest flared, sinking with her presence, and for a moment, the bay's chaos faded, leaving only the thread between them. Stronger now, a choice they'd both claimed. A medic approached, scanner humming, but Mira waved them off with a sharp gesture, her silver hair swaying as she kept her eyes on Tyler. "He's fine," she said, her tone firm, protective, and the medic retreated. Muttering into a calm, Tyler's smile widened, a flicker of amusement breaking through his exhaustion, but it faltered as a shadow loomed beyond the gates. A gray figure climbing from the chasm's edge, scales clicking faintly, yellow eyes burning through the mist. "Korr," Tyler breathed, his hand instinctively dropping to his empty pack, heart lurching as the Syrak warrior staggered forward, blood dripping from his flank, his armor cracked but intact. The surviving ally trailed behind, scales dulled with defeat, but Korr's gaze locked on them, a snarl curling his lips. "You think this ends it?" Korr rasped, his voice a guttural quake, leaning on a jagged rock for support. "The hunt proves nothing. Your bond's a stain on Syrak honor. I'll rise again, human, and your blood will paint these halls." His yellow eyes flicked to Mira, a flicker of old pain beneath the rage, and he spat, dark blood staining the floor before turning to limp away, his ally following in silence. Mira's grip tightened on her blade, her violet skin taut with tension, but she didn't move, her green eyes narrowing as Korr vanished into the station's depths. "He's wounded, not broken," she said, her voice low, a storm brewing beneath her calm. "He'll gather strength. Others will follow him. This isn't over." Her hand slid to Tyler's arm, her claws grazing his skin with a heat that sank into him, grounding him against the threat still lurking. A Nexus officer approached, datapad glowing, flanked by the Syrak envoy from Central Command, his scales bristling with agitation. "Vance, Commander Mira," the officer said, voice clipped, swiping through hollow data. "Hunt's concluded, Korr's defeated, bond upheld." But the pod's readings spiked during the fight. He tapped the screen, and a holographic display flickered to life. Syrak runes pulsing alongside a human genome map, red markers flaring where they intersected. "Your DNA, Vance, it's active now." Syrak traces fully awake. "You're not just a hybrid, you're a catalyst." Tyler's stomach twisted, his gaze darting to Mira as the envoy hissed, yellow eyes glinting with suspicion. "A catalyst?" he echoed, voice tight, his hand brushing the tear in his sleeve where Korr's claw had struck. "What does that even mean?" The officer's lips thinned, her tone cold. "The pod sync didn't just bind you, it unlocked something. Syrak Tech recognizes you as kin, ancient kin. Nexus wants answers. Why you, why now?" She turned to Mira, eyes narrowing. "In your vanguard split, Commander. Korr's rallied dissenters. War's brewing if this escalates." Mira stepped closer to Tyler, her violet skin shimmering like a dying sun, her presence a shield against the officer's words. "Let them brew," she said, her voice a quiet storm, fierce and unyielding. "He's mine, by right, by choice. They'll answer to us both." Her hand slid to his wrist, her claws tracing a path that sparked heat in his veins, her scent swirling around him like a challenge, a wild promise that drowned out the bay's hum. The envoy clicked his scales, voice a hiss. "Choice or not, human, you've stirred a fire you can't quench. Korr's pride won't rest, nor will Syrak law bend easily." Tyler swallowed, his pulse loud in his ears as Mira's touch lingered, her green eyes locking with his, bright with a trust that burned through the tension. "I didn't start this fire," he said, voice low, meeting the envoy's glare. "But I'll damn well fight it with her." His hand found hers, fingers lacing briefly, her violet skin hot against his, and the hum in his chest shifted. Less a burden, more a strength he was starting to wield. The officer nodded curtly, dismissing the envoy with a glance. "Nexus will monitor. Rest while you can. Korr's retreat buys time, but not much." She turned away, leaving them in the bay's flickering light, the hollow display fading into static. Mira pulled Tyler aside, her silver hair brushing his shoulder as she leaned in, her breath a warm whisper against his ear. "You're more than they know," she murmured, her voice a velvet growl, her hand resting on his chest, feeling his racing heart. "More than I dare hope." Her violet skin pressed against him, a quiet fire that sank into his core, and the pod's sync pulsed. A bond now tested, a promise yet to unfold. Tyler exhaled, his hand brushing her silver strands, the weight of her words settling into him. "Then we'll face it together," he said, voice hoarse, caught in the tide of her nearness. "Whatever's coming." She nodded, her green eyes fierce with a vow, her scent a lure that pulled him deeper as the bay's shadows closed in around them. The Nexus station's sterile hum buzzed through the corridors as Tyler and Mira made their way from the Proving Grounds prep bay, their steps echoing in unison despite the weight of exhaustion dragging at them. Tyler's uniform hung tattered, blood from a shallow claw mark staining his sleeve, his toolkit slung over his shoulder like a battered shield. Mira walked beside him, her violet skin still aglow with the sheen of battle, her silver hair tangled and wild, brushing his arm with every stride. Her blade rested at her hip, its edge dulled by Korr's blood, and the pod's sync pulsed between them, a steady rhythm, a bond now tempered by fire and trust. They'd barely reached the residential wing when a shadow loomed ahead, a Syrak figure, smaller than Korr, her scales a muted blue, her green eyes sharp with urgency. She stepped forward, claws clicking against the floor, her voice a low hiss. "Mira, Commander, we must speak. Now." Her gaze flicked to Tyler, suspicion flickering, but she pressed on. "I am Lisa, second of the Vanguard. Korr's alive, and he's not alone." Mira's posture stiffened, her hand brushing Tyler's arm as if to anchor him, her violet skin taut with tension. "Lisa," she said, her voice a quiet storm, green eyes narrowing. "You were at the hunt, watching. Speak plain, what's he done?" Lisa's scales bristled, her claws flexing as she glanced down the corridor, where drones whirred faintly in the distance. "He's rallied the dissenters. Half the Vanguard, warriors who see your bond as betrayal. They call you weak, Mira, tainted by a human. Korr's wounded, but he's moving, gathering arms in the lower levels. They want war, against Nexus, against you." Her eyes darted to Tyler again, harder now. "And him, his blood's the spark. Syrak law bends for no outsider." Tyler's stomach twisted, his hand tightening on his toolkit as Mira's grip on his arm grew firm, her claws grazing his skin with a heat that sank into him. "War," he said, voice low, meeting Lisa's glare. "I didn't ask for this. I'm no threat to your people. Tell them that." Lisa's hiss sharpened, her scales clicking as she stepped closer. "They don't care, human. The pod woke something in you. Syrak blood, ancient and wrong to them. Korr's fanning the flames. Claims you'll unravel our lineage, our honor." She turned to Mira, voice softening but urgent. "I stand with you, Commander, but we're outnumbered. Nexus won't protect us if this breaks." Mira's green eyes flared, fierce and unyielding, her silver hair swaying as she faced Lisa fully. "Korr's pride blinds him," she said, her tone resonant, cutting through the hum. "He lost the hunt, lost his claim. This is vengeance, not honor. We'll face him together." Her hand slid to Tyler's wrist, her claws tracing a path that sparked heat in his veins, her scent, wild like a forest after rain, swirling around him like a vow against the coming storm. Before Lisa could reply, the corridor's lights flickered, a harsh calm crackling overhead. "All personnel, security breach, lower levels. Syrak's signatures detected, armed and active. Lockdown imminent." The voice cut off, replaced by a low siren, and the air tightened with the weight of imminent chaos. Tyler's pulse spiked, his free hand brushing Mira's, fingers grazing her violet skin as he turned to her. "They're moving fast," he said, voice steady despite the dread coiling in his gut. "If Korr's got weapons down there, my traps won't be enough. We need a plan." Mira nodded, her green eyes locking with his, bright with a trust that burned through the tension. "Your mind's our edge," she murmured, her voice a velvet growl, her hand resting on his chest, feeling his racing heart. "We'll outthink him, strike where he's blind." Her violet skin pressed against him, a quiet fire that sank into his core, and the pod's sync pulsed. A bond now a weapon, a promise forged in defiance. Lisa stepped back, scales glinting as she drew a smaller blade from her belt. "I'll scout, find his numbers, his caches. Meet me at the freight docks in 2 hours. If we're to stop this, we hit now, before Nexus turns on us too." She hesitated, her gaze softening on Mira. "You chose him over tradition. I hope he's worth it." With a nod, She vanished into the shadows, her footsteps fading into the siren's wail. Tyler exhaled, his hand finding Mira's, fingers lacing briefly as the lockdown lights bathed them in red. "War over me," he said, voice hoarse, caught in the tide of her nearness. "This is insane. I'm just a guy who fixes things." Her lips curved, a faint smile bearing the edge of sharp teeth, and she leaned in, her silver hair brushing his shoulder, her breath a warm whisper against his ear. "You're more," she said, her tone soft but fierce, her hand sliding up his arm, claws grazing with a heat that made his blood sing. "A spark, a bridge. You fix chaos, I fight it. We're one now, Tyler, and I'll burn worlds to keep you." Her violet skin shimmered like a dying sun, her scent a lure that pulled him deeper, and the hum in his chest flared. Less a chain, more a strength he was starting to wield. The siren grew louder, footsteps pounding in the distance as Nexus security mobilized, and Tyler tightened his grip on her hand, his resolve hardening. "Then let's fix this," he said, voice steady, meeting her gaze. "Traps, blades, whatever it takes. I'm not losing you either." Mira's green eyes blazed, fierce with a vow, and she squeezed his hand, her presence a shield as the station trembled around them. "To the docks, then," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, pulling him forward into the storm. "We end this together." The corridor darkened, shadows stretching long as the lockdown sealed them in, a war brewing in the depths, and a bond burning brighter than the chaos closing in. The Nexus station trembled under the lockdown's red glow, its corridors sealed tight as sirens wailed in a relentless drone. Tyler and Mira moved fast, their footsteps echoing through the freight docks, a sprawling maze of crates, humming generators, and shadowed catwalks deep in the station's underbelly. His toolkit rattled against his hip, lighter now, its traps depleted from the hunt, but his hands clutched a makeshift pulse device, cobbled from scavenged parts in the engineering bay, untested but thrumming with potential. Mira strode beside him, her violet skin aglow with a faint sheen, her silver hair streaming like a comet's tail, her blade drawn and gleaming in the dim light. The pod sync pulsed between them, a fierce rhythm, a bond now, their strength against the storm. "Lisa said 2 hours," Tyler muttered, voice low as he scanned the docks, his breath misting in the cold, recycled air. "Korr's down here, armed and pissed. If I don't stop him now, this war's on us." His fingers brushed the pulse device, a flicker of doubt gnawing at him. But Mira's presence steadied him, her scent, wild, like a forest after rain, cutting through the metallic tang of the docks. Her green eyes flicked to him, fierce and steady, her hand brushing his arm with a warmth that sank into his bones. "We'll stop him," she said, her tone a quiet thunder, resolute and unshaken. "Your spark, my steel. He's no match for us together." Her claws grazed his skin, a fleeting heat that sent a shiver through him, and her silver hair swayed as she tilted her head, listening to the hum of the generators, a hunter attuned to the prey beyond. A faint click echoed from the shadows, and Lisa emerged, her blue scales dulled with dust, her blade notched from a recent skirmish. "He's close," she hissed, her voice urgent, green eyes darting between them. 10 warriors, armed with plasma cutters and old Syrak tech. They've rigged the docks, explosives, traps of their own. Korr's at the core, wounded but raging. He wants her head, human, and Mira's surrender. Mira's grip tightened on her blade, her violet skin shimmering like a dying sun, her green eyes blazing with defiance. "He'll get neither," she said, her voice a low growl, stepping closer to Tyler, her shoulder brushing his with a heat that grounded him. "Lead us, Lisa, flank them. We in this now." Lisa nodded, vanishing into the shadows, and Tyler adjusted the pulse device, his hands steady despite the sweat beading on his brow. "Explosives change things," he said, voice low, meeting Mira's gaze. "If I can hit their tech with this, disrupt it, we've got a shot. Cover me. I'll make it count." The hum in his chest flared, sinking with her resolve, and she squeezed his arm, her claws tracing a path that sparked fire in his veins. They moved as one, weaving through the crates, the docks a labyrinth of steel and shadow. A plasma bolt sizzled past, searing a crate to ash, and Mira lunged, her blade clashing with a Syrak warrior's cutter in a shower of sparks. Tyler ducked low, wiring the pulse device to a generator's exposed panel, his fingers flying as shouts and steel rang out around him. Lisa's cry echoed from the left, her blade felling a dissenter, but more closed in, their scales glinting under the red lights, their roars shaking the air. Korr loomed at the core, a massive silhouette against a rigged console, his gray skin scarred and bloodied, his yellow eyes burning with fury. "You!" he snarled, voice a quake as he raised a plasma cannon, its barrel glowing hot. "Your blood ends this. Human, Mira's mine again." He fired, the bolt scorching the floor where Tyler had stood, but Mira shoved him aside, her violet skin hot against his as she deflected the next shot with her blade, sparks raining down like stars. "Never yours," she spat, her green eyes fierce, lunging at Korr with a speed that blurred her silver hair into a streak of light. Tyler hit the pulse trigger, and a wave of energy surged out, frying the dissenter's cutters and stalling Korr's cannon, its glow flickering out. The explosives beeped erratically, their timers glitching, and Mira seized the opening, her blade slashing Korr's arm, drawing a roar of pain as he staggered back. The docks shook, a crate toppling as Lisa felled the last warrior, her scales streaked with blood, and Tyler darted to Mira's side, his hand finding hers amid the chaos. "Finish it," he said, voice raw, fingers lacing with hers, her violet skin afire against his own. She nodded, her green eyes locking with his, bright with a trust that burned through the fray, and together they charged, her blade striking Korr's chest as Tyler triggered a final trap, a hidden charge from the hunt, erupting beneath the Syrak's feet. Korr roared, crashing to his knees, blood pooling as the console sparked behind him, his yellow eyes dimming with defeat. "You ruin us," he rasped, voice fading, and Mira drove her blade deeper, silencing him at last, her silver hair falling like a curtain over her face as she stood over his broken form. The docks fell silent, the lockdown's red glow flickering as Nexus drones swarmed in, their scanners humming. Lisa slumped against a crate, panting, her blue scales glinting with sweat, and Tyler pulled Mira close, his chest heaving, her violet skin pressed against him, hot and alive. Her silver hair tangled in his fingers, her breath ragged against his neck, and the pod's sync pulsed, a bond forged in blood and fire, unbreakable now. "You're safe," she whispered, her hand on his chest, feeling his racing heart, her green eyes bright with a raw, unshaken promise. Her scent wrapped around him, a wild lure that drowned out the chaos, and her lips hovered near his, a breath away from claiming more. Tyler exhaled, his hand brushing her silver strands, the weight of her nearness sinking into him. "We're safe," he corrected, voice hoarse, caught in the tide of her. Together, his fingers tightened on hers, the hum in his chest, no longer a mystery, but a truth they'd forged, a fire within that no war could quench. The drones circled, Nexus voices crackling through the comms, but for a moment, they stood alone, two souls woven tight, the galaxy trembling around them.